Yesterday was Mahatma Gandhi's 140th birthday. And here was a leader, here was a visionary, who I think was the original environmentalist. He was the original thinker who clearly, without actually using these words, understood the reality of misuse, overuse and abuse of the global commons. Because he said, when he was asked by a journalist, Mr. Gandhi, wouldn't you want India to become as prosperous as Britain? He thought for a moment and he said, well, it required Britain to use up half the resources of this planet to reach its current level of prosperity. How many planets would India require? And I think that sums it up. The basic fact is that whether you look at stocks and flows, whether you look at historical responsibility, the reality is that we have a limited and finite global commons. And that, in this case, is the atmosphere of this earth. It was Kenneth Boulding, an economist who I admired greatly and who I had the privilege of knowing, another person well ahead of his time, who coined the phrase spaceship Earth. The fact is, we are all inhabitants of spaceship Earth. And we really don't have any open economy. In other words, we cannot reach high levels of prosperity. We cannot produce goods and services, the externalities of which are going to be felt and will influence the global commons without finding some means by which we pay for that use of the global commons. So, I really think this is an issue of principles. At the same time, I think as responsible citizens, both as individuals and as members of nation states, we have to find means by which we arrive at some means by which we are able to share the tasks and the responsibilities for correcting this situation. I was very engaged and deeply engrossed in the example that Professor Shelley gave us of the use of the Marshall Funds. And it's a very interesting way of looking at where we need to stabilize the concentration of greenhouse gases in the Earth's atmosphere, because that's what is going to determine the changes in the climate that are going to take place. We in the IPCC, and I'm very happy to see that Professor Cynthia Rosenzweig, who is here, who has been a great leader in assessing the impacts of climate change on a whole range of ecosystems, including species. If we continue on the path that is based on inaction, then clearly the impacts are going to be totally unbearable and would certainly exceed our capacity to be able to adapt to them. There is a limit to how much we can adapt. Adaptation is essential and rather urgent, because there is already a certain inertia in the climate system of the Earth, as a result of which climate change will happen. These impacts will increase and will become more frequent, more intense, and therefore that, I think, is inevitable, and we have no choice but to adapt. But unless we mitigate adequately and in an ambitious and focused manner, we are clearly going to create impacts that will far exceed our capacity to be able to adapt to them. And this, I think, is really the crucial question. My belief is that if we can accept that the Earth's climate has to stabilize, within certain limits, then perhaps the next stage of dividing up the tasks that would be essential for meeting that goal perhaps becomes practicable. I'm happy to say that the G8 has at least laid down this aspirational goal of limiting temperature increase to 2 degrees Celsius, and that I think is only a symptom. It's only an indicator of the kinds of impacts of climate change and the complexity of climate change that's going to take place. Because with the 2-degree increase, as we brought out very clearly in the fourth assessment report of the IPCC, we would have some very serious impacts that certainly for some parts of the world could really drag them down under. I stuck my neck out when I spoke 11 days ago at the UN, at the meeting of the world leaders, and I said something which goes beyond the assessment of the IPCC. I said that my own assessment indicates that if we don't take action, there would be at least a dozen states that are likely to become failed states. And that clearly is an outcome that the world cannot possibly afford to accept. We already have serious problems with just 2 or 3 states that can be classified as failed states. If you had a dozen of them, then we're clearly asking for chaos. Because what is it that failed states across the globe provide to the global community? Terrorism, illegal drugs, arms and armaments, and illegal immigration. I might mention that before the G8, I tried very hard to get an appointment with the Italian Prime Minister, Mr. Berlusconi, and I was asked if you were to get an appointment. Of course, I didn't get an appointment. I suppose he was busier with other more interesting objects at that point of time, which I shall not speculate on and will not allude to in direct terms. But I told him precisely, I told the person in question precisely this. I said, if I meet him, I'm going to tell him, here is Italy, which is extremely vulnerable to developments that would take place not very far from its own location. And therefore, you're likely to see the ill effects of neglect, of inaction, which the world cannot afford to continue with very much longer. Now, I also want to mention that the day before yesterday, we had a major event in Washington, D.C., where we had Dr. Steve Chu, we had John Holden, we had John Kerry, we had Al Gore, we had Congressman Steve Israel, and from India, we had Dr. Farooq Abdullah, our Minister for New and Renewable Energy, Mr. Jairam Ramesh, the Minister for Environment and Forests, and a whole range of senior people from both sides from both these countries. And our effort was to see how we might be able to arrive at areas of partnership. Because as Professor Bhagwati reminded us, we are 2 major democracies, the world's largest democracies. And therefore, I would say that it's tragic that so far we have not been able to arrive at an understanding and an agreement whereby we work together to sort out this common problem that the whole of humanity faces. I was very encouraged at the statements that were made from both sides. Let me start with what Senator John Kerry said. As you know, he and Senator Barbara Boxer have introduced a bill in the Senate, which he said vociferously that he is determined to see that it gets enacted before Copenhagen. And if that happens, I think it provides a very powerful message that the US is at the table. And I believe Copenhagen is going to be influenced deeply by what the US does. If the US does not come up with something concrete, something solid, then that's really going to have a discouraging influence on every delegate, every delegation. On the other hand, if they're able to get something through, similar to what Senator John Kerry said the day before yesterday, I think that really provides momentum to the whole process. If you take the example of Japan, just a month ago I was in Japan and I met the Prime Minister even before he had taken office, and he said exactly the position that he took in the UN and made a statement on very clearly that Japan is going to reduce its emissions by 25% over 1990 levels by 2020. Now, here is a country where I think the industry has been opposing any kind of commitment for much too long, and with all the previous governments that we've had in the last 3 or 4 years. But the new government has stuck its neck out and has made this commitment, which I think is extremely hard, and provides an example for others to follow. So, may I say that while undoubtedly there are reasons for concern that perhaps in Copenhagen we might not get a strong agreement, I think there are equal reasons to believe that with the extent of resolve that has been expressed by several leaders, something concrete will come out of Copenhagen. And we have seen in the past, in the negotiations, often these things are settled at the midnight hour and sometimes past the midnight hour, which is not very healthy state of affairs, but that's the reality of the situation. When you've got countries with very diverse interests and trying to get the best of a deal, then they keep holding their cards very close to their chest, and it's only when the 0 hour approaches and an agreement has to be reached that you find things start falling into place. I think it's important to see that we create the spirit similar to what Dr. Schelling told us about the Marshall Plan, and that certainly was a major initiative on the part of the US, and I didn't know that the US had committed 2% of its GDP at that point of time. I hope this message goes out to the current administration, not only in this country but elsewhere too. I was very happy to read well over a month ago when Prime Minister Gordon Brown came up with this proposal for $100 billion fund, which he said should be built up to provide support for adaptation and mitigation measures to the developing world. And I think that would be serious money. Some may say that $100 billion is not enough, it should be much more. But the fact is that $100 billion is a considerable sum of money, and it shows the seriousness of purpose, which would certainly create the right kind of spirit. Unfortunately, Mr. Gordon Brown's proposal didn't get the kind of attention it deserved because just a day earlier, a great singer in California had died, and all the newspaper and television space was taken up by the tragedy of his death. However, that's something which is on the table, and I hope the developed countries will pick up on that. And that certainly is far below the 2% of the GDP that Professor Schelling reminded us about. And I can tell you that climate change requires a similar resolve. It requires a similar initiative. And we cannot possibly ignore the fact either of historical responsibility or the distinction between stocks and flows. What India and China are going to produce today and in the coming years are essentially flows of emissions. But the problem is being caused by stocks. or you might say the occupation of the global commons, which you cannot possibly ignore. This is not to say that countries like India should not be part of the solution, and I'm very happy to report that our Environment and Forest Minister, Mr. Jairam Ramesh, has in the past few days clearly clarified the fact that India is not going to be part of the problem, it is going to be part of the solution. And just for the information of this audience, may I say that India has its National Action Plan on Climate Change, which consists of 8 different missions, and 2 of them, after careful deliberation, have been given in principle approval. The first of them is the solar energy mission, which would require India to set up 20,000 megawatts of solar power generating capacity by 2020 or thereabouts. And under this, there would be a role not only for government funding, which incidentally will come in the form of subsidies to kickstart the process and to create an industry that essentially will be able to benefit from economies of scale and pass on that benefit to the consumers in India. But it will also have a role for the private sector. And I might say that the Clinton Climate Initiative and my institute, TERI, are working together to implement 2 major projects in the states of Gujarat and Rajasthan, each of which would be in the range of 3,000 to 5,000 megawatts. Now that is a major step forward, and we're keeping our fingers crossed that this would materialize, and I'm sure it will happen. Now, I'm mentioning this only to emphasize the fact that India is not doing this out of altruistic reasons. India is doing this for 2 very important reasons. Firstly, because we have to ensure energy security for the country. We cannot possibly continue with growing imports of fossil fuels, which is inevitable unless we develop alternatives and substitutes. And secondly, we are doing it because we believe that we are responsible citizens and climate change is a serious threat for several parts of the world, including India and our neighborhood, and therefore we have to be part of the solution. We must not only establish our credentials by doing things within India, but perhaps even provide solutions that could be of relevance to other parts of the world. I just want to mention by way of a historical fact, in January 1989, my institute and I had organized a major conference in India, in New Delhi, called Global Warming and Climate Change Perspectives from Developing Countries. And this was really the first major conference on climate change organized in a developing country, where we got some of the best and the brightest from all over the world. And as part of that, I myself prepared a paper along with my colleagues, where we computed the extent to which different countries in the world had contributed to the emissions of greenhouse gases historically, and therefore to the stock of greenhouse gases that existed in the atmosphere. And we put forward the plea that actions should necessarily be based on this differentiation. And may I say, this concept is not only because of our advocacy, but also of others, found its way into the Framework Convention on Climate Change. And therefore, I think whatever happens in Copenhagen must be within the principles of the Framework Convention on Climate Change. May I also say that Copenhagen is not going to be the end of the world. As long as we come up with a reasonably strong agreement that sets in motion certain actions that don't necessarily spell out everything in detail and lay down a plan of action for every country in the world, as long as it has its priorities right, as long as it provides a direction for actions that are going to follow, I think it would have achieved a significant purpose. I also believe that the IPCC, when it brings out its 5th assessment report in 2013 and 2014, will certainly lead to a major reappraisal of whatever is agreed on at Copenhagen. This may sound like speculation, but I can assure you that's likely to happen. And I'm heartened by the kind of impact that the IPCC 4th assessment report has had in the last 2 years, ever since it came out. And of course, on the basis of a deliberate effort on our part to spread the message and to make sure that our findings are not only included in the documents that we have prepared, but also reach out to the general public and to the leadership of the rest of the world. So, my feeling is that if we create this level of awareness and we build on it, then not only would leaders, at least in democratic societies, get the assurance that they have the backing of their constituents, but you would also see a large number of actions being implemented by the constituents themselves. What Governor Schwarzenegger said yesterday raised a lot of laughs, but I think it has a lot of truth in it. He said, look at Saturday Night Fever, that one single movie led to the development of so many discotheques all around the world. And he said that, I became a bodybuilder and became the idol of so many people. Now every hotel, including this hotel, has a place to work out, and everybody is now into exercising and working out. Of course, I have to clarify that I wasn't inspired to follow his example. It's a little too late in the day for me to do that. And he still has huge biceps to such a touchable example. The guy is remarkable, I must say. But I think what we really need is a grassroots movement. One could even question whether the nation state is capable of dealing with these long-term issues that are tricky. And therefore, again, may I go back to Gandhi, this is the day after his 140th birthday. See what he was able to achieve purely by spreading the message to a country that without any violence, without a single arm being picked up, a single weapon being fired, was able to get freedom against all odds. And it seems to me that we need to create that kind of a spirit. And we need to spread the message whereby you will see NGOs, you will see companies, you will see local governments, cities certainly, that can take the initiative and take the lead. And you take the example of California in this country. The federal government has now built on the example of California when it comes to emissions of greenhouse gases and automobiles. If California had not taken the lead, it would have been so much more difficult for the federal government to come up with a similar measure. So I think what we really need now is this kind of an initiative. And if Copenhagen gives us the framework, gives us an agreement, and most importantly, accepts the overall global goal of stabilizing the climate of this planet, whether it's 2 degrees Celsius as the G8 has exemplified in its declaration, or 1.5 degrees Celsius, I think that's what is going to motivate societies across the globe. And I believe that we in India and the United States have to find common ground. I'm very happy to say that the spirit that prevailed in the meeting that we had 2 days ago with about 280 participants and these luminaries from both sides really struck a spirit that I'm sure will lead to much better understanding and perhaps coordination in the development of an agreement in Copenhagen. And if this happens with a few other countries, then we can be reasonably optimistic that success will take place in Copenhagen. I would like to once again express my gratitude to Professor Bhagwati, a person who I've admired for a long, long time, and thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for those two excellent presentations. Now we have about 20 to 25 minutes left at most for Q&A. So we have 2 mics. If you could just go up there and queue up there. And I think you have to go there. Yeah.
Should I start?
Please tell us who you are.
I'm Rao Uluru. In fact, Rao Uluru.
From where?
Well, I have several affiliations, one of which is I do teach and write and so on. But I'm representing myself at the moment. Thank you for the perspectives. One of the things, most of the folk